Welcome to Theosis, and on today's podcast, I'd like to discuss with you humility and reconciliation conversations, as well as in relationships, and how my faith is teaching me to try to enter conversations with a sense of humbleness, to hear and to be heard on important topics facing me as a Christian in America today. Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Tim Nazinski of Waterloo United Methodist Church, and today on the podcast, Theosis, I'm discussing how communicating with those who think differently requires both inner and outer dialogue about our true selves. Today, we're going to be discussing Psalm 4. We'll be hearkening all the way back to this past Sunday in the lectionary where we find Psalm 4. And so the psalm reads this way. Answer me when I call, O God of my right. You have given me room when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. How long, O people, shall my honor suffer shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? But know that the Lord has set apart the righteous as God's own. The Lord hears when I call. Be angry, but do not sin. Commune with your own heart in your own beds and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, oh, that we might see some good. Lift up the light of your countenance upon us, O Lord. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me lie down in safety. And so that was the responsive reading from this past Sunday, the 15th, I think it was. And it was really about a conversation between David and God, and also David, God, and Absalom in a prayerful way. And so it's Walter Brueggemann who talks about the Psalms, the spirituality of the Psalms, if you will. He says that the Psalms break into three pieces, or three ways of kind of communicating prayer. They are Psalms of orientation, disorientation, and new orientation. And I think that Psalm 4 is one that is absolutely a psalm of disorientation. It's a poem and speech, as Brueggemann writes, that matches a season that it's ragged, painful, and in disarray. It sometimes sounds like a complaint. It sounds like they're suffering and pain. And I think that Psalm 4, really speaks to us today about being in a sense of suffering and pain when it comes to communicating with one another. And I think that was why I spent some time with it this Sunday, just kind of analyzing it, preparing it, and praying about it, as well as being a part of our conversation during the lectionary and during our services. And so before we get too far into Psalm 4, I wanted to let you know that I've been thinking about it and praying about it before I discussed it in church. And I thought, if we ever consider the life of Adam and Eve when we look at this. And so in the second chapter of Genesis, we find Adam surrounded by creatures, but feeling alone and lonely. And from his body, God provides Eve, a partner, but much, much more. In 2016, there was a TED Talk by a physicist and entrepreneur, Riccardo Sabatini, and he demonstrated that a printed version of our entire genetic code would occupy some 262,000 pages, or 175 large books. Of those pages, just about 500 would be unique to us. And so it's more than just DNA here. I think it's interconnectedness and its relationships, and our words and our actions have implications for one another. And so that's why I'm thinking about Psalm 4. And so we read that Psalm 4 is part of a prayer that harkens back to a tough time in King David's life. He was being pursued by his son Absalom. They had been in conflict, and I don't want to get too far into the conflict of the wise, but there was definitely a sense that David had done something. Obviously, Absalom had done something, and they just couldn't get it together. They just couldn't get along. And David goes into this place of prayer. And he begins with, "Be gracious to me, and hear my prayers." And so that's what he talks to God about. If he's in the middle of this conflict, and David lives in conflict. Any understanding of anything from the books of Samuel tell us that, when it comes to conflict, David's a pro at it. And so maybe just this once, we're hearing that David is that maybe you can teach an old dog new tricks. And David desperately wants to reconcile with Absalom. And so David asks for grace from God. He's aware of his own behavior, but he's also aware of the behavior of those who are at odds with him. And it's just not good. And he's trying to find some kind of middle ground, some kind of way to get reconnected with people that he's in conflict with. And I wonder if we feel the same way. There's no doubt that in our country today, in the United States, in the world actually, if you kind of take other looks and other relationships, we feel like we're in conflict. We feel like we struggle both to understand and to be understood. We struggle to talk to one another. And it causes some suffering and it causes some pain. And so it reminds me of in the fourth Psalm, it says, "How long, you people, shall my honor suffer shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies?" So it's real simple that we're in a disconnect with one another. We're in some kind of dispute, and people are putting more on that and not putting anything into, hey, can we get back together? Can we rebuild the relationship? Can we have some kind of way where we feel like we're making progress because we care about one another? And that's why I brought up the Adam and Eve comment, is because if we think about ourselves, we think about our humanness, that we are a part of everybody else. And that, we could be surrounded by all our stuff and all our things and all our electronics and all our screens. But ultimately, the biggest, most important part of us, the biggest, most important part of our lives is our experiences and relationships with others. And there's a sense that we're frail in the absence of one another. And that, our bone of our bone, even if it's not a sibling or a parent or a child, is bone of our bone. It's flesh of our flesh. It's heart of our heart and soul of our soul. And it's incredibly important to us. And so this psalm, when you start to kind of overlay it with the second chapter of Genesis, gives us this feeling that we don't want to always be in conflict. We don't want to be in estrangement, because the separation, it hurts others and it hurts ourselves. And that's why I ask us, have we ever thought of ourselves as Eve or Adam? That we saw that we're alone. And in the absence of other folks, we cleave for, we desire for a togetherness. And we're desperate to be back to it. And if we saw every other person as Eve saw Adam, and as Adam saw Eve, that a portion of us, our flesh, our bone, are a part of other people, maybe that would make us think less about ideas and opinions and political beliefs, and more about care and thoughtfulness, love and understanding. I mean, there's no doubt about it. This is hard work for me, as it would be hard work for maybe other people as well. I drive my car and I see bumper stickers, and I know that some of those are in direct opposition to my core beliefs and my opinions. But at my core, at my cosmic level, the person who's driving that car, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And that's a truth. And if we remember that we're all one single common family, and that our existence is interconnected, maybe, just maybe, we have that David moment. Maybe, just maybe, I'm not perfect and you're not perfect, but that doesn't mean I need to treat you only on the things that I see as frailties. Not to pile on, if you will, on the things that I see that may be wrong with you. But to think in David's way is to come forward with, I know that I've got issues. Do you agree that you might have some issues? And then we could put those aside and all kind of, and in some way kind of get together. To see value in another person, that's hard because, technology makes us want to be disconnected in a face-to-face manner. And sometimes in our all the time phones and screens, it's easy to hide away and to not be engaged. And this people, real people, Eves and Adams, Adams and Eves, face-to-face connections, encounters that are real and spiritual, could be good for our hearts and our souls. And so Psalm 4 says this, but know that the Lord has set apart the faithful for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. So David begs to be set apart from the negativity through his prayer. And this is really good advice, I think, for us. To set ourselves apart from trying to find fault with others. To come to conversations on common goal and common good. And the better common ground is to see that we're intimately intertwined with everyone as members of the same human family, the same human organism, the same flesh and bone as everyone else. But more important, that we have this same closeness. And that's what we were talking about with Adam and Eve, is this relationship. That from me is you, and from you is me. I think that it comes from the rib because it's in like the gut of us to want to be with one another. It's in the gut of us to feel lost and lonely and afraid when there's nothing there. Because I think that we share some stuff. Deep down, I think we all desire justice and fairness in our lives and in the lives of other people. And this means, as Father James Martin describes, a spirituality of encounter. When we encounter people who think differently, who act differently, who believe differently, but when we meet them in a real human, personal way, we see exactly what that scientist talked about, that it's bigger than that, it's more powerful than that, and more important. I want to live in the hope that David hopes for in his relationship for those who he separated. And when he writes, there are many who say, oh, that we might see some good. Let the light of your face shine on us, O Lord. You have put gladness in my heart, more than when their green and wine abound. There is a light and a gladness in connecting with one another. To forgive and be forgiven. To move close to one another. To be humble in our love. To know that we are under one God, intertwined. I think this creates much better relationships for us. And much better relationships give us the warmth and glow of God shining on our faces. When we see each other in deep wholeness and in goodness, we experience gladness and a true sense of belonging in our lives. This might sound a little silly, but I remember that TV show Cheers. It seemed that whenever certain characters came in, they were welcomed in a robust way. And I want to be welcomed like that. Because I think everybody wants to be welcomed like that. For people to be genuinely excited for one another. To be rooting for everyone's well-being, both physically, emotionally, and spiritually. That's the work that I think David's going through, when he prays to God in the fourth Psalm. To be glad for goodness, for the sake of goodness, to see the world as not a zero-sum economy where my good is at the adverse effect of you. But there's enough. There's enough good for you, and there's enough good for me. That there is something that is for all of us. That as children of God, our most important, most valuable, most sacred holding is God's love and the sacredness of one another. And I think there's peace in that. A closeness to each other, and more importantly, a closeness to God. I think that it's David's intention when he closes Psalm 4. He writes, I will both lie down and sleep in peace. For you alone, O Lord, make me lie down in safety. And I think that is the only way to lie down with any sense of peace today in America. It's not a perfect system, I totally get that. And I'm not a perfect person. I realize full-heartedly that there's bad stuff going on in the world, close and far, locally and globally. However, I think that in developing relationships with one another, with honoring each other, with seeing the human dignity in one another, we experience God at a very deep rhythm, at a very deep sense of commitment to some greater goodness. And so I'm going to try to live my life a little bit more close to that. And maybe it's not going to be as exciting as being in conflict. And maybe it doesn't set off as much fireworks. But I think it's important to do that because I think that how I live and how I communicate with humility and with respect to others is far more important than winning arguments or being found to be important in some other way. It's Josh Radnor in an article in an airline magazine who wrote that there is no reliable statistic for hearts opened and wounds healed. There is no way humble and reconciling conversations are being tracked on social media or major news forums. And you know what? I got to be okay with that. Jesus came to demonstrate that the kingdom comes one person and one conversation at a time. This union with each other is a part of our union with God. This connection with ourselves, with God and others is, well, it's theosis. I pray this day that you experience a little of this theosis, the transformative process whose aim is likeness or union with God. It's something that John Wesley studied while enjoying God's love. This is Tim Nazinski. God loves you, and so do I.